to a box canyon, only to find out that 4 or 5 other people now have referred to it as a box canyon. We're in it. Everybody understands we're in a box canyon. You've got to ride out. So when we're riding out, what are we going to do? I would ask the Senator of Texas. Give me 3 amendments.
Well, I thank the Senator from Kansas for his very fine question. And let me make a couple of general points about the Senator from Kansas first, and then I will answer his important question. I want to say that Senator Roberts is an old lion of the Senate. That you were here last night, that you are here this morning supporting us is a big, big deal. That the Senator from Kansas, a respected leader of this body, a graybeard, and I would note a very well-liked senator. One point I'll make about Senator Roberts, I would say, in my humble opinion, I think he is one of the 2 funniest senators in the Republican conference. I would say Senator Roberts and Lindsey Graham both have fantastic senses of humor. I am happy to, although I suspect, yield for a question, but not yield the floor.
Well, the question is, some people are funny and some people are humorous. I may be one of the most humorous. Senator Graham is truly funny.
I will note on that question I can provide no response other than to say, as they say in mathematics, QED, that point is granted. But I will note, Mr. President, that for the Senator for Kansas, as a respected senior senator, to come and support this effort, and even more importantly, for the Senator from Kansas to have the courage to disagree with party leadership and express a willingness to vote against cloture, because doing so would allow Majority Leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, to fund Obamacare on a straight party line vote with no input from Republicans. That takes courage. And I guarantee you, Mr. President, it is noticed that Senator Roberts is standing with us. It is noticed that Senator Sessions is standing with us. It is noticed that Senator Enzi is standing with us. It is one thing for the Young Turks. It is one thing for those who have been dubbed the wacko birds to be willing to stand and fight. But when you see senior elder statesmen of the Senate standing side by side, I would suggest, Mr. President, we are starting to see what I hope will happen this week, which is seeing Republicans unify. I would like to see all 46 Republicans vote together on cloture on Friday or Saturday, whenever that vote occurs. I'd like to see all of us stand together and vote against cloture, because we say we can't in good conscience, with the commitments we have made to our constituents, vote to allow the Majority Leader to fund Obamacare on a straight 51 vote, partisan party line vote. I would like to see that happen, and I would note that Senator Roberts' presence here at night and in the morning is beneficial for making that happen, and I hope it causes other respected leaders in our party to give a second thought, that perhaps the division in the Republican conference is not benefiting the nation or benefiting the Republican Party. Perhaps it is not serving the interest of our constituents. So before I answer your question directly, that point, I believe, is an important point to make, Mr. President, that Senator Roberts' support is significant, and also that Senator Roberts' very kind compliment about the way I've endeavored to conduct myself. I know the way Senator Mike Lee has always conducted himself, with respect for the views of others, not speaking ill of any member of this Senate, Republican or Democrat. That is certainly what I have endeavored to do, and it is meaningful. Senator Roberts' compliment that in his judgment we have had some modicum of success achieving that. I would note that that characterization is at least mildly at odds with what one might think if one simply read the New York Times. If one read the New York Times, one would expect that perhaps I am leaning over, biting my colleagues with bared fangs. And so I appreciate the senator from Kansas's observation that in his judgment, we have not conducted ourselves that way. And then the reason is simple. Look, the New York Times wants to spill gallons of ink on personalities, on people, on politics, and on anything except the substance. Mr. President, I'll tell you, I would be perfectly happy if not a single story coming out of this ever mentioned my name. If every story just focused on Obamacare, is it working or not? Is it helping the American people or is it hurting? If every story simply said the Senate stayed in session all night because Obamacare is a train wreck, because Obamacare is a nightmare, in the words of James Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters, because the American people are losing their jobs, are being forced into part-time work, are facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums, are losing their health insurance. That's why the Senate was here. And so I would be thrilled if all of the coverage focused on the substance instead of the distraction that is the silliness of the back and forth. Now, Senator Roberts posed a very important question, and it went to process. It went to how this proceeding is moving forward. There used to be a time when this body was described as the world's greatest deliberative body. I don't think anyone familiar with the modern Senate would describe it as that today, because this body doesn't work anymore. This body is no longer a deliberative body. This body is now an instrument of political power used to enforce the wishes of the Democratic majority, both on the minority, but more importantly on the American people, disregarding the American people's views, the American people's concerns. So what are we told? The Senate of days of old, there were two cardinal principles that were the essence of what it meant to be in the Senate. One, the right to speak, and two, the right to amend. And for a couple of centuries, any senator could offer any amendment on just about anything. That's what made this process work, and open amendments. And, you know, did that make a few people take votes they didn't necessarily want to? Yes. But, you know, Mr. President, if we're being honest with our constituents, that shouldn't trouble you. If you're telling your constituents what you believe and if you're voting your principles, there shouldn't be a vote you're afraid of. It's only a concern. Votes are only problematic if you're trying to tell your constituents one thing and trying to do something else in Washington. So what is the process that is supposed to play out here on this continuing resolution and this continuing resolution to defund Obamacare, to fund all of the federal government, defund Obamacare? Well, we are told that first there's going to be a vote on cloture on the motion, cloture on the bill, rather, to shut off debate. And if 60 senators vote to do so, if Republicans cross the aisle and join Harry Reid and Senate Democrats in shutting off debate, we are told we will get one amendment, apparently drafted by the Majority Leader Harry Reid, and that amendment will fund Obamacare in its entirety. We'll gut the House bill. We'll deliberately do that. That is the stated intent. And we are also told that other amendments will not be allowed. Now, in the course of this discussion, we have discussed a number of other amendments, all of which I think would be terrific. One amendment, the senator from Kansas mentioned, would be an amendment to repeal the medical device tax. Now, I would note that is an amendment which we had a vote on in the budget process, and an overwhelming majority of senators in this body voted for it. My recollection is nearly 80 senators voted for it. And yet it didn't pass into law because of the peculiarities of the budget process. So that is an amendment, presumably, that if it was allowed, would be adopted. And I would suggest that is perhaps the reason why it won't be allowed. Because it would be adopted. And look, repealing the medical device tax would take one aspect of Obamacare, the punitive, crippling tax that is hammering the medical device industry, that is driving medical device companies out of business or near out of business, that is hammering jobs and that is restraining innovation. that is restraining medical device innovation, which means we know to a certainty if there's not innovation, if there's not research and development, if there's not investment with medical devices, there will be new medical devices that aren't discovered. There will be people whose pain is not alleviated, whose suffering is not alleviated, perhaps whose lives are not saved. So that would be one amendment. Another amendment that I think we ought to have a vote on would be Senator Vitter's amendment. Senator Vitter's amendment to revoke the exemption that President Obama, contrary to law, unilaterally put in place for members of Congress and their staff. And Senator Vitter's amendment would subject every member of Congress, every staff member, and the political appointees of the Obama administration to the exchanges, just like millions of Americans are going to be. Indeed, I support an amendment that some Republican senators have talked about that would expand Senator Vitter's amendment to all federal employees, because our friends the Democrats frequently tell the American people what a wonderful thing Obamacare is. Look at this tremendous benefit we're bringing the American people. Well, if it's so wonderful, then the majority leader, then the Democratic senators, then the congressional staffers should be eager to get it if it's such a tremendous improvement. If it's so wonderful, President Obama, after all, his name is on the bill, Obamacare, in the popular vernacular, should be eager to get it. His political appointees who are enforcing it on us should be eager to get it, and the federal employees should be eager to get it. Now, we all know that they're not. We all know that this exemption came after a closed-door meeting in the Capitol with Majority Leader Harry Reid and the Democratic senators, where, according to the press reports, they asked, please let us out from under this because it will be so devastating. We don't want to lose our health care. And I understand that. Look, I would not be eager myself to be on the exchanges. I'm certainly not eager for my staff to be on the exchanges. Many of them are very concerned about it. I may lose very good staff over it. But I think there's a broader principle, which is that different rules should not apply to Washington than apply to the American people. If we're willing to subject millions of Americans to the exchanges, if we're willing to let people lose their health insurance as is happening all over this country, take UPS. UPS just recently sent letters to 15,000 employees saying you're losing your spousal health insurance. Your husbands and wives who were covered are losing their coverage. Now, President Obama promised if you like your plan, you can keep it. That is proven categorically wrong. A great many of those husbands and wives that had health insurance may be forced onto these new exchanges with no employer subsidy. That is a lousy place to be. It's exactly the lousy place to be that members, senators, congressional staff are complaining. Don't put us in that briar patch. But you know what? If Congress is going to put the American people in that briar patch, then you better believe we should be there with them. And if we don't like it, the answer isn't exempt us. The answer is exempt the American people. If it is intolerable for us to endure it, it should be intolerable for the American people. Another amendment that I think we ought to vote on is an amendment stripping the IRS of enforcement authority on Obamacare. We have seen the political abuses that the IRS is capable of. I don't know anyone who is eager to have the IRS have the world's largest database of our health care information. Another amendment we ought to vote on is a delay in the individual mandate.
On that point, would the gentleman yield for a question?
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
There are 6 federal agencies in the metadata-base that are involved in this. When I kept inquiring, when the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Baucus, asked a representative from the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, that's CMS, that's referred to in the health provider community as it's a mess, and said, who is a navigator? And this was before we understood that it was pretty much all community organizers. There's 3 basic organizations in Kansas, 1.5 million, and so they're out there knocking on doors. Now, the problem is we don't know what people are signing up for, or they don't know, and I don't know, and we've made all sorts of inquiries, and so finally I got the 16 pages that you have to fill out to be eligible to sign up, and the 61 pages that you had to fill out then to be a member of the exchange. Now, that got a lot of news, and so they reduced the number by simply reducing the font size from about 16 point or 12 point down to 8 point. said just read more carefully. I got to page 3. I would not put down the information that they wanted to know. And there have been stories about scammers who are looking at these regulations or these sign-up sheets, no matter how big they are, and saying, aha, if they have to give their Social Security number, I can call them and say, it's the law, and you're going to have a lot of fraud and abuse. I don't know who's going to, maybe the IRS could take a look at that. And one other thing about the IRS, the Finance Committee and the bipartisan effort, we haven't held many hearings, but we're getting closer and closer and closer to what happened with the IRS denying people First Amendment rights. And I would give a lot of credit to Senator Hatch and to Senator Baucus working in a bipartisan effort. Long about November, there's going to be quite a story. And there's a V, if you can see the V, and we have Lois Lerner here, and it goes up here to the Justice Department, it goes to the White House. Now, we'll fight. Now, we're getting a lot of communications. We're not making a lot of hearings about it. We're not standing in front of mirrors, okay? So we'll get there. But you've made an excellent point about the IRS with all the problems that they have had over this denial of the First Amendment, not only to Tea Party groups, conservative groups, but pro-Israel groups and a whole bunch of other groups. And they're still doing it. And so consequently, you've made an excellent point. And so why on earth would we want the IRS to be in charge of your health care? Not to mention 5 other agencies in a huge database. That information should be between you and your doctor. And you'd have to break down the doggone doors in order to get that in the dead of night, to get that kind of information, as opposed to giving it to the federal government with all those different agencies, with all sorts of opportunity for fraud, abuse, and virtually everything else. Sorry to get wound up on that, but you made an excellent point trying to think of a question to make this legal. Don't you think that this is a trail that we just don't want to go down?
Well, I thank the senator from Kansas for that excellent question, and I'd like to make 2 points in response, and then I want to give an opportunity. The senator from Kentucky, the senator from Oklahoma are both waiting, I believe, to ask questions, so I want to move expeditiously to allowing them to do so. But before that, it is important to address the very good point the senator from Kansas raises. And I would say, as the first observation, there are at least 3 more amendments that ought to be voted on in connection with the continuing resolution. One, the senator from Kansas suggested, is an amendment defunding these navigators, defunding this slush fund that is being used to basically fund liberal special interest groups in the states, much like the stimulus. Yet another plan that is used to write checks to groups that are little more than political action groups. That would be a vote we should have. Another vote we should have is a vote to protect the privacy of our information. The IRS is creating the largest database in history of our personal health care information, and there's been report after report after report that the protections on privacy, on cybersecurity, are pitifully, woefully inadequate, that there are identity thieves, that there are unscrupulous characters just getting ready to mine those databases. You know, the senator from Kentucky, who shortly will ask a question, has been a leader on privacy. The idea of the federal government collecting personal information about all of our health care and then putting it in one place so A, the federal government can have it, and B, anyone, if it's poorly secured, can break in and steal it. We ought to have an amendment to require real protections for our privacy before any of this goes online. And yet another amendment we ought to have is the President has unilaterally delayed the employer mandate. We ought to have a delay of the individual mandate. I would note that the House passed that and a substantial number of Democrats voted for it. Now, all of those points, so that went through 6 amendments, and I'm pretty sure we could come up with more. I would note that earlier in the evening, I had an exchange with Senator Kane from the state of Virginia, who asked a question, I forget the exact terms of it, but to paraphrase, he said, can't we work together on improving Obamacare, stopping it from being, he didn't say this, but this is me saying this, the train wreck, the disaster, the nightmare that it is? And my response was absolutely. We should improve it. We should fix it. We should have amendments. And when I listed some of these that we discuss now, and the problem is, and I suggested to the senator from Virginia, you should address your concern to Majority Leader Harry Reid, because he's the one who's shutting down the process, saying the Senate is not going to operate with open amendments. We're not going to have an opportunity to improve it. And let me make a final point on this. In terms of the political theater that is Washington, why does this matter right now? Look, there are lots of Republicans who would like votes on everything I said, and there's some virtue to getting a vote. But to be honest, many Republicans are fighting to get that vote in some context where it's purely symbolic, where they're real happy because every Republican can vote together and any Democrat can vote against it, and then it can become fodder for a campaign ad. Let me suggest a far better approach is to have these amendments voted on in a context where they can be passed into law. And the continuing resolution is that context. Everyone understands that at one stage or another this is must-pass legislation. Everyone understands that we will fund the federal government. We have to fund the federal government. Nobody wants a government shutdown. Now, we may get one if Harry Reid and President Obama forces one, but nobody wants it. And so voting on it now in the context of this continuing resolution is different from a symbolic vote, a political vote, because it actually could fix these problems. It's not simply Washington symbolism. And that's why I find it all the more striking that so many Senate Republicans are suggesting they may be willing to vote with Majority Leader Harry Reid and with the Senate Democrats to cut off debates, to allow one amendment drafted by the majority that would totally fund Obamacare, that would gut the House bill, and to shut off every other amendment. Now, if this were any other context, my colleagues on the Republican side would be up in arms. We would see the so-called old bulls of the Senate united in saying the process is being abused. And we would get 46 Republicans voting against cloture. And by the way, nobody, if this were any other context, would make the silly argument that, well, voting for cloture is really supporting the bill. Once the majority leader has indicated that once cloture is granted, he's going to introduce an amendment to gut the bill and go the exact opposite way, allowing him to do so on a 51-vote partisan vote is not supporting the bill, it is undermining the bill. And so the stakes of this fight right now are whether this body is willing to listen to the American people, whether Democrats are willing, whether Republicans are willing. And I would say, Mr. President, what has to happen to change how this body operates is we must make D.C. listen.
Would the Senator yield for just a procedural question and maintain the floor?
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
Yeah, last night at 10 o'clock when I was privileged to be down here with you and we went over a lot of things, something happened this morning. Of course, you stayed here. I went home, I ate, I went to bed, and I'm back here now. The senator from Kentucky has been waiting for 40 minutes. I'm not going to use his time, but what I would like to do is this. Something happened after I left last night, after a statement I made having to do with Hillary health care, and I want to share that with you. But I don't want to do it now on his time. I'd like to, hopefully, if you're going to be here at 9 o'clock, I'd like to get back in line and share what happened last night after I left here. Is that all right?
I thank the senator from Oklahoma, and I can tell you, as I said at 2:30 in the afternoon yesterday, that I intend to stand against Obamacare as long as I'm able to stand. And at this point, I feel confident that at 9 a.m. I will still be able to stand. There will come a point when that is no longer the case, but we have not yet reached that point.
The senator from Kentucky allowing me to come in front of him.
Mr. President, will the senator from Texas yield for a question?
I'm happy to yield for a question to the senator from Kentucky without yielding the floor.
There's been some discussion, and the senator from Kansas recently put this question forward of, how we would fix Obamacare if we were allowed to. And I think there are sort of two parts to that. The first part of the question is, will we be allowed to offer any amendments to try to make Obamacare less bad, to try to fix Obamacare? Will Republicans, which are virtually half of the country, be allowed to participate in this process at all? Obamacare was passed with entirely Democrat votes, not one Republican vote. It's a policy that has been very, very partisan. It's a policy that now even supporters of Obamacare are saying my goodness, this is going to really be a problem for the country. But you're exactly right. We're getting ready to go through a process where there are going to be no amendments on fixing Obamacare. There will be not one thing offered. Former President Bill Clinton saying there's problems with it. The Teamsters are saying there's problems with it. Warren Buffett's saying there's problems with it. The 15,000 people at UPS who lost their spousal insurance are saying there's a problem with this. Are we going to be allowed to offer amendments? It appears as if there won't be any amendments on this. It appears as if there's nothing forthcoming, that there will be any debate. And this is important for the American people, because this is being portrayed as, oh, Republicans are obstructionists. Republicans won't want to do this. Republicans don't want to. Well, it's exactly the opposite. The president wants 100% of Obamacare, as he wrote it, as the Democrats wrote it, with no Republican input. So when we go around the country and people say, why can't you guys get along? Why can't you guys figure out some way of figuring out how to make our health care system better? It's because we're getting 100% of Obamacare as written by the president, and it's his way or the highway. What he's talking about is really, even though they say the opposite, he wants to shut the government down. They salivate at shutting the government down. Over the last 3 months, as you've brought this issue forward, who's been talking about shutting the government down? Have you been talking about it? No. Have I been talking about it? No. We've been specifically saying we don't want to do that. Who talks about shutting the government down nonstop every day? The Democrats, the president, and their liberal friends in the media. So as I get to my question, what I want to ask are some things about how we would fix it. I think Senator Roberts' right. The other side says, oh, well, they don't have any answers. They're not willing to fix Obamacare. Well, the truth of the matter is we've been talking about this for years now. But we've been drowned out by the Obamacare, I want everything all the time, everything I want I'm going to get. There are many fixes for our health care. I'm a physician in practice for 20 years. I saw it every day. Number one complaint I got, health insurance costs too much. So what did Obamacare do for health insurance costs? It drove them up. Did absolutely nothing. Even they're admitting it. But you have to understand why health care costs went up. Health care costs went up because we're mandating what health insurance. People say, well, I would like to have my kids covered. Well, sure, we can cover your kids, but it's not going to be free. It's going to have a cost. So everything that people say they want, it's not free. It elevates the price of your health insurance. When you elevate the price of health insurance, what happens? Poor people have more of a difficulty buying their health insurance. What else did Obamacare do that we did that's exactly the opposite of what we should do? Well, there's something called health savings accounts that originated about 10 or 15 years ago. They were expanded gradually, and they were the best thing to happen to health care probably in the last 30 years. But what happened? We went the opposite way. Obamacare is now narrowing a health savings account. Now, why is a health savings account important? Because you can save money tax-free, you can carry it over from year to year, and then you can buy higher deductibles. So contrary to what people think, and say it may be counterintuitive to some people, the way to fix health insurance is to have higher deductibles. Because what does that mean? Cheaper insurance. You want cheaper and cheaper and cheaper insurance. As you have higher deductibles, you have cheaper insurance. When you have cheaper insurance, you've got all this extra money that you can use to pay for day-to-day health care. When you do that, what happens? You drive the price of health care down. I know that's exactly right, Mr. President. As you increase deductibles, as you get the consumer involved in health care, you drive prices down. In my practice as an ophthalmologist, there are two things that really insurance didn't cover at all. And the prices were reduced most dramatically in the two areas in which the health insurance didn't cover anything. If you wanted to buy contact lenses, most time health insurance doesn't cover it. Price went down every year for 20 years. LASIK surgery to get rid of the need for glasses, much more expensive, but the price went down for 20 years because the consumer paid. What would the consumer do, or the patient? The average patient calls 4 doctors before they have LASIK surgery. So the thing is they drive prices down. People say, I don't want to pay more out of pocket, I want to pay less. Well, that's sort of the natural impulse, is to want to pay less. But you may pay less at the door, but you're paying more for premiums. Or if you're not paying it, and your employer's paying more for premiums, what ends up happening is there are less jobs. I know the senator from Texas is familiar with the French philosopher and parliamentarian and writer Frederick Bastiat. Bastiat often talks about the seen and the unseen. It's the consequences that are visible to the naked eye before you get started, but then the things that you didn't realize were going to happen, the unintended consequences. It's sort of like saying, well, if government, well, let's have government build the hospitals. Let's have government hire the doctors. Let's have government build everything. And we'd see all these bright, shiny things, but we wouldn't see where the money came from, where the money wasn't spent, where the economic growth could have occurred. And so what we have to think about when we think about Obamacare is we have to think about, do you believe in freedom or coercion? Obamacare is riddled with mandatory this, mandatory that. I think there are several hundred mandates. When you hear the word mandate, that's not freedom. That's your government telling you have to do something. It should be about mandatory versus voluntary. We should have bills that originate here that say you're free to do things. We've gone the opposite way. We're taking away freedom and we're adding mandates. At its core, Obamacare is about freedom versus coercion. And as you add in these levels of coercion, not only do you lose your freedom, they cost money. So it becomes more expensive. So we took a health care system where 85% of the people had insurance, and we made it more expensive for everybody. We made it more expensive by mandating what goes into the insurance. So, for example, a 30-year-old or a 32-year-old, it's illegal to buy a high-deductible policy. You won't hear this. Obamacare has made it illegal to buy a high-deductible policy. You can get it under age 30, but you can't get it over age 30. Why would you want a high-deductible policy? Maybe you're a plumber in your own business and you want to have a $5,000 deductible so you can pay $1,000 a year in premiums or $2,000 in premiums. But how do you ever get there? You can't get there unless you allow freedom. You need the freedom of the marketplace. Instead of limiting it, realize what you're getting. When you ask for Obamacare, when you get Obamacare, you're getting mandates, but you're getting limited choices. Freedom means choices. Mandates, coercion mean less choices. The exchanges will be very few choices. I will be on the exchanges. I will have to go to the exchange in Kentucky and buy my insurance. I'm not very happy about it. In fact, I think if I've got to do it, I think Justice Roberts ought to have to do it. Justice Roberts loves Obamacare so much, I'm for voting to have Justice Roberts trot on down to the Obamacare registry, the Obamacare index, and get his insurance like the rest of us. So my amendment, we've talked about some amendments to include people. I think everybody, all federal employees, if Obamacare is so good, everybody ought to get it. And the thing is we'd be so fed up we'd rebel in this country. And that's what I think the senator from Texas has started. Hopefully a rebellion against coercion, a rebellion against mandates, a rebellion against everything that says when big government wants to shove something down your throat and said, take it or you go to jail. And people say, oh, we're not going to put people in jail. The heck we won't. What do you think happens? You'll get fined first. You don't pay your fines, you'll go to jail. They're telling you you have to take their health insurance as they conceive of it, with absolutely no Republican input. Not one Republican vote, and they're unwilling to have any amendments. What's this fight about? This fight's about whether or not we're going to have a society or a Congress where we can debate over how to fix things. Obamacare's a disaster. Even its own authors are now saying it's a train wreck waiting to happen. Even the president, who's in love with this Obamacare, he's saying it's going to be a problem. He's delaying the individual mandate. But realize on another level what some of our complaints are. Some of our complaints are that by making it mandatory and by him doing it after the fact, that he's not obeying the law. This is pretty important. We talk about the rule of law a lot of times around here. But what's important about the rule of law is that Congress passes legislation and the president can sign it and execute it. Obamacare was passed with only Democrat votes, but here's the thing. He's now amending it after the fact. You saw one of the union officials coming out with a gleeful smile on his face from the White House. Is he going to get a special deal that nobody else gets? Is the president going to come to your town in Middle America or my town in Middle America and meet with me and give people in my town an exemption. No, he's been giving exemptions to his friends. This is patently un-American. It's unconstitutional. We will fight this through the court cases, but it's going to take a year or so till we can get to the Supreme Court. But can the president amend legislation? Can he write legislation without the approval of Congress? That's what he's doing. Now, his argument would be, I'm just trying to fix the problems that the legislature created. Yes, the legislation was 2,000 pages, nobody read it. And then they've created 20,000 pages of regulations. We have no idea. Many of these states, you don't even know who to call yet. But if you do know who to call and there has been an exchange set up, there are limited choices. So whereas you might have had hundreds of choices, you now will have 2 or 3 choices. Where you once had freedom, you're going to have coercion. Where you once had the ability to buy cheaper insurance if you wanted it, if you wanted to make the decision to pay your out-of-pocket expenses on a day-to-day basis yourself and buy cheaper insurance, it will no longer exist because the government now says they know what's best for you. They know what you should do. Your choices really, to them, have gone out the window. So we talked about amendments. If we were allowed to have amendments, if we were allowed to try to fix Obamacare, I'd try to bring the price down. The best way to bring the price down is not to tell people they have to have a high deductible or not to tell people they have to have an HSA, but it's to expand their ability to choose an HSA. An HSA is a health savings account. So currently, or before Obamacare, you could put $5,000 a year in your HSA. Now it's gone to $2,500 a year. If you have a child who's autistic or a child with spina bifida or a child with a severe learning disability, you can spend $10,000 a year on their health care and trying to help them to adapt to life. Right now what's happened is they're limiting that ability. Health savings accounts should be unlimited. We should take them from $2,500, where the president has squashed them. We should make them unlimited. If you get lucky and you don't get sick, your health savings account should be able to go into your kid's education. We should allow health savings accounts not just for the family, but for every individual member of the family. They should be enormous over time, and then you would buy cheaper insurance. This is also the answer as to how you drive the price down. And here's something that, through the years as a physician, people always came up to me and they asked. They would say, all right, I went to the hospital and I had heart surgery and it was $100,000. But then I looked at my bill very closely and the mouthwash was $50 and I'm infuriated. And I'll say, well, did you call? Did you try to negotiate with the hospital? They say, no, my deductible is $20. So when you have a low deductible, when you don't pay, you aren't connected to the product. Unless you're connected to the product, prices don't come down. So this is a fundamental aspect of capitalism, and this is why when you go to Walmart or to any retail store, Hobby Lobby, wherever you go, the prices are bid down because there's competition and you ask the price. But think about it. If you went to Walmart and your deductible was $10, so you paid a copay every time you went to Walmart, would you ever look at any prices after $10? So you can see what would happen to the entire retail world if we had health insurance for buying goods, if you had health insurance for going to the mall, if you had health insurance for going to buy shoes, cars, you name it. If you only had to pay $10 or you only had to pay $100 to buy a car, all you had was a copay to buy a car, the price of cars would go through the roof because you wouldn't care about the price. This is about having some sense. The people who gave you Obamacare are not bad people. They have big hearts, I think, but sometimes not so big brains. They're trying, they want to help people, but they haven't figured out that the unintended consequences of Obamacare are part-time workers will have less hours. Full-time workers who are on the margin where the business is struggling will lose their jobs. If I have 51 employees, I may well go back to 49 employees if I'm struggling. If I have 1,000 employees and I provide health insurance for them, but my competitor decides to dump them on the government exchange, maybe I have to, too, to compete, because maybe I have to offer the lowest price. Maybe the end result of Obamacare is the people it was intended to help is precisely who it's going to hurt. So I think we have to think this thing through. We have to think as a society whether we're for choice or against choice, whether we're for mandates or we're for voluntarism. I think it's very important that we look beyond the immediacy of what we're trying to do. And like I said, don't discount the motives of people on the other side. I think they want to help people, but I think they're going to hurt precisely the people that they want to help. As we look at this Obamacare debate, as we look at this disaster, there's another question you might ask. If Obamacare is such a great thing, you would think you could give it away. So this is something that's going to be free, and they're having trouble giving it away. So what have they done? They're spending tens of millions of dollars to advertise to you that it's such a great thing. So if you can't sell somebody something that's free, I think there's a problem. So Obamacare is free and they can't sell it. They've enlisted the president now to sell it. They're going to barnstorm all across America selling something that's free. They will have people, government agents on planes, flying hither and yon, knocking on your door and say, please take this free health care. Please sign up for free health care. If you can't sell free health care, there must be a problem with it. We are spending tens of millions of dollars on TV, millions more having people going door to door to convince people that it's a good idea. Ultimately, we should try to help those who can't help themselves. But in order to figure out how you want to help the 15% that didn't have health insurance, we should have looked at the problem more carefully. Of the 15% that don't have health insurance, a third of them are young and healthy and make more than $50,000 a year. So a third of the problem had nothing to do with not being, well, it did have something to do with not being able to afford it. It had to do with the health insurance costing too much. So we should have tried to figure out how we lower health care costs, and if you're a young, healthy person, we should have expanded health savings accounts. There were ways that we could fix this. And what I would like to ask the senator from Texas, my question is, do you see a way forward? Do you see that we can get the other side to come forward and tell the American people that, yes, we made some mistakes. We made some mistakes, and even our friends are telling us we made these mistakes, and that we want to work with you. Because I think the problem with the perception out there is that we don't want to work with them, but it's completely opposite of the truth. The truth of the matter is, as I see it, is they won't work with us. They won't open the process. We can't have a debate. We're having a debate, but where's the other side? And why can't we influence legislation? Why can't we be part of trying to fix health care? I don't know if Obamacare is fixable, but health care is fixable. And all the things they didn't do, all the things about, you know, the main problem of health care is price. Costs too damn much. Can we fix that? Could they come to this body and say, we're going to have amendments, we're going to have an open amendment process, and we're going to try to fix Obamacare? My question is to you, do you see an opening? Do you see an opening where maybe the president would compromise, maybe the president would come and say, yes, I'm willing to work with you to fix health care in this country?
I thank the senator from Kentucky for his very fine question. And the answer is absolutely yes. I believe there is an opening to do that. I believe we can address the train wreck, the nightmare that the American people are facing that is Obamacare. And we can address the very real harms that are being visited upon Americans as a result. You know, I want to note the senator from Kentucky has been a clarion voice for liberty. And that is one of the many things I appreciate about my friend Senator Rand Paul. I think my favorite phrase from his question was a phrase that occurred about midway through his question, where he said something to the effect of, we need a rebellion against oppression. And that phrase I liked. That's a turn of phrase, a particularly excellent turn of phrase, Mr. President. I will confess, it reminded me of a movie series that was in the theaters when the senator from Kentucky and I were both kids, young adults, and that was the Star Wars franchise. The discussion of a rebellion against oppression, I think it captures a lot of what's going on here. We started this debate some 18 hours ago talking about the divide between the Washington establishment that is not listening to the American people, that is forcing its will on the American people, and the people of this country. And I will confess that phrase, a rebellion against oppression, conjured up to me the Rebel Alliance fighting against the empire being the Washington, D.C. establishment. And indeed, immediately on hearing that phrase, I wondered if at some point we were going to see a tall gentleman in a mechanical breathing apparatus come forward and say in a deep voice, "Mike Lee, I am your father." This is a fight to restore freedom to the people. This is a fight to get the Washington establishment, the empire, to listen to the people. And just like in the Star Wars movies, the empire will strike back. But at the end of the day, I think the Rebel Alliance, I think the people will prevail. The senator from Kentucky asked, can we actually make real progress in this? Yes, if the people do it. To be perfectly honest, the senator from Kentucky can't get it done. I can't get it done. Senator Mike Lee can't get it done. I don't think there's an elected official in this body who can get it done. Only the American people can speak with a loud enough volume that it forces, number one, Republicans to unite as we should be uniting, all 46 Republicans against cloture, to say no, not a single Republican will vote to give Harry Reid and the Democrats the ability to force through a single amendment that guts the House continuing resolution, that funds Obamacare on 51 partisan Democratic votes, and that shuts out all other amendments. And number two, if the people rise up in sufficient numbers, I believe that Democrats of good faith will ultimately have no choice but do the same thing, listen to the people. You know, during this debate, we have read, we have discussed the letters from the roofers unions, a letter from the Teamsters, where each of them used the same phrase, they could remain silent no more. Both of those letters began by saying that they were Democrats who'd supported the president, who supported Democrats for Senate, supported Democrats for the House, who had campaigned, who had worked for them, yet they could remain silent no longer because Obamacare is hurting millions of Americans. It is a nightmare, in the words of James Hoffa, the president of the Teamsters. Now, if they can remain silent no longer, Mr. President, I would say to the senator from Kentucky, I do have faith that there will be Democrat senators who will feel that same pang of conscience to remain silent no longer, but to actually speak up for the American people. But it will only happen when Republicans unite. If Republicans are divided, if we are throwing rocks at each other, we can't expect Democrats to cross their leadership. Republicans have to unite first in order to get Democrats to come together and listen to the people. You want to know what this whole fight is about? It is about, together, we must make D.C. listen.
I have a follow-up question, Mr. President, for the senator from Texas.
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
You know, I think one of the questions that should not only be asked of you, but should be asked of the president. Why doesn't the president voluntarily take Obamacare? I mean, it's his baby. He loves it so much. Why didn't the president take it? He could voluntarily go on the exchanges. In fact, I'm sure they'd welcome him down at the D.C. exchanges. In fact, I really think that ought to be a question they ought to ask him at the press briefing today. Mr. President, are you willing to take Obamacare? If you don't want it, why are we stuck with it? So if the president can't take it, if Chief Justice Roberts doesn't want it, if nobody, and here's the thing, you want to see a rebellion? We should ask federal employees to take Obamacare. That's what my amendment says, not just Congress. I'm willing to take it. I don't want it. I absolutely don't want it, and I've been frank about it. I'm not a hypocrite. I didn't vote for it. I think the whole thing's a mess, and I don't want it. But the thing is, if I've got to take it, I think the president ought to get it. He ought to get his full dose of his own medicine. I think Justice Roberts should get it. I think he contorted and twisted and found new meaning in the Constitution that isn't there. And if he wants it so much, if he thinks it's justified, and if he's going to take that intellectual leap to justify Obamacare, he ought to get it. There's millions of federal employees. They don't want it. But guess who they vote for usually? I think it's a partisan question. I think if we were to put it forward and say Obamacare is such a wonderful thing for everybody, let's give it to the federal employees, my guess is we wouldn't get a single vote from the opposition party on this. But we won't even get a chance because they don't want to talk about it. Obamacare is good. We're going to shove it down the rest of America's throat. We'll exempt ourselves. I have a constitutional amendment. I frankly think that Congress should never pass any law that they're exempted from. I think there's an equal protection argument for how it would be unconstitutional for us to do so, and yet we've done it repeatedly. But my question to you is, what do you think? Do you think maybe we should ask the President to come down today and sign up for Obamacare? I think we should ask him that today, every day, and henceforth. Mr. President, such a good idea. Why don't you get it?
I thank the senator from Kentucky, and my answer is yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. And indeed, the Washington Press Corps were focused on the substance of this debate, on the issues that matter to the American people. The reporters would ask the President at every news conference he conducts and every opportunity they have, Mr. President, are you willing to be subject to Obamacare to be put on the exchanges like millions of Americans are being forced? They would ask the majority leader of the Senate, and indeed every Democratic senator who met with the President and who, according to press reports, at whose behest members of Congress were exempted. The press were doing the job of a watchdog press holding leaders accountable, actually speaking truth to power. They would ask every Democratic senator, not once, not twice, but over and over and over again, are you willing to be put on the exchanges without an employer subsidy, just like millions of Americans who are losing their health insurance because of Obamacare? And if not, why? And as I have noted multiple times during the course of this debate, I very much support what Senator Paul suggested about making every federal employee subject to Obamacare. Now, let me be clear. Doing that, it's a lousy thing to do to federal employees. It's a lousy thing to do to members of Congress. It's a lousy thing to do to congressional staff. None of them like it. Mr. President, as you and I know well, it is hard to find an issue that causes more dismay, if not panic, among congressional staff than the idea that they might be thrown into the exchanges with no employer subsidies like millions of Americans. Ironically enough, including presumably many of the staff who worked on drafting Obamacare. And you know, it's why the American people are so fed up with this. It's a manifestation of the philosophy, good enough for thee, but not for me. In Washington, Washington plays by separate rules. The rich and powerful, those who stroll through the corridors of power, they get exemptions. Just not hardworking Americans. If you're at home, and it happens to be the case that you've got 2 or 3 high-paid Washington lobbyists on your payroll, you may be in a good shape. You might get an exemption. But if you don't have the ability to walk into the West Wing, if you don't have the ability to pull the levers of power, then what President Obama, the majority leader in the United States Senate, is saying to you is you are out of luck. We answer to the friends of this administration, but not to the American people. Listen, I think under no circumstances should members of Congress be treated better than what we are doing under the law, forcing upon millions and millions of Americans. Now, I would note, Mr. President, that during the course of this debate, I have been privileged to receive support from a great many senators, but 2 in particular I want to mention right now, Senator Rubio and Senator Paul. And I want to mention them because on any measure of hipness or coolness, Mr. President, I will readily concede I can't hold a candle to them. Indeed, I remember in the debate over drones, Senator Rubio began quoting from rap lyrics. And I'll confess to being clueless enough that I didn't even know what he was referencing. I was sure it was something far too hip for me to know. Although I will note I did read Toby Keith lyrics, but that's probably not quite in the same genre. And I will note that Senator Paul has a following with, as he describes it, folks in Birkenstocks and beards and earrings. Different sort of cool that, again, I could not remotely hope to compete with. I'm a lawyer from Texas. But what I can try to do to keep up with, because after all, we all have a little bit of competitiveness in wanting to keep up, I would like to provide a little more detail on something I referenced earlier, which is the speech that Ashton Kutcher gave at the Teen Choice Awards. Now, to be honest, referring to the senator from Florida and the senator from Kentucky is cool. As terrific human beings as both of them are, is almost oxymoronic, because I think I will take it as a given that there is no politician on the planet who would actually qualify as cool. Ashton Kutcher, I don't know. I don't expect ever to meet. I suspect his and my politics may be quite different. And yet at the Teen Choice Awards, he gave a speech that I thought was remarkable. He was there to accept an award for playing Steve Jobs in the movie Jobs. And he did much more than accept the trophy. He talked about the importance of work, hard work, and his speech was so remarkable that I took the opportunity to tweet it out because, frankly, Mr. President, Ashton Kutcher can reach young people in a way that I never can, that you never can, that no member of this Senate can, and I thought the message was important, and it was important about a principle that is imperiled by Obamacare. Let me read from the relevant portions of Mr. Kutcher's speech. He said, quote, "I believe that opportunity looks a lot like hard work. I've never had a job in my life that I was better than. I was always just lucky to have a job. And every job I had was a stepping stone to my next job. And I never quit my job until I had my next job. And so opportunities look a lot like work." He went on, "The sexiest thing in the entire world is being really smart and being thoughtful and being generous. Everything else is," and he used a mild expletive for manure. "I promise you, it's just manure that people try to sell you to make you feel like less. So don't buy it. Be smart, be thoughtful, and be generous." And then he ended his speech by saying everything around us that we call life was made up by people that are no smarter than you, and you can build your own things. You can build your own life that other people can live in. So build a life, don't live one, build one. Find your opportunities and always be sexy. Now, I salute that message. I think it's a message that I hope every young person in America hears. But it's also a message that embodies what is imperiled by Obamacare. You know, what Mr. Kutcher talked about, I was always just lucky to have a job. I've never had a job in my life that I was better than. It makes me think about my father. When he came from Cuba, his first job washing dishes for making 50 cents an hour. He was lucky to have that job. He certainly was not better than that job. And if he hadn't had that job, the next sentence that Mr. Kutcher said, "And every job I had was a stepping stone to my next job." As we've discussed during this debate, if he hadn't had that first job, he wouldn't have got his next job as a cook. And if he hadn't had that job, he wouldn't have got his next job as a teaching assistant. If he hadn't had that job, he wouldn't have got his next job as a computer programmer at IBM. If he hadn't had that job, he wouldn't have been able to start a small business and work towards the American dream. And you want to talk about the tragedy of Obamacare. It is the millions of young people, the millions of single moms, the millions of Hispanics, of African Americans who are struggling, who want to achieve the American dream, who because of Obamacare can't find a job, who because of Obamacare, small businesses, they're not hiring, they're not expanding. Small businesses create 2/3 of all new jobs. If you're struggling, that first job washing dishes, if Obamacare were the law in 1957, Mr. President, I think there's a very good chance my father never would have gotten that job washing dishes. And if he had gotten the job, Mr. President, and Obamacare were the law, I think it is virtually certain his hours would have been forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week. And you know what? He couldn't have paid his way through college on 29 hours a week. So one of two things would have happened. He either would have had to drop out of college, or he would have had to get a second job at 29 hours a week and juggle the balance between each of them. That is what is so critical about this issue, is maintaining the opportunity for those struggling to achieve the American dream. I want to, secondly, share some more material. During the wee hours of the morning, we had the opportunity to consider some excerpts from Ayn Rand. And I want to point to some more excerpts from Ayn Rand that I think are relevant to the battle before this body. The first from Atlas Shrugged: "We are on strike. We, the men of the mind, we are on strike against self-immolation. We are on strike against the creed of unearned rewards and unrewarded duties. We are on strike against the dogma that is the pursuit of one's happiness is evil. We are on strike against the doctrine that life is guilt." Another on the filibuster, on the effort of the American people to get Washington to listen to us. From the Fountainhead: "Integrity is the ability to stand by an idea." Also from the Fountainhead: "No speech is ever considered but only the speaker. It's so much easier to pass judgment on a man than on an idea." Mr. President, that particular quote, I think more than anything, is addressed to our friends in the media. I want to read it again. "No speech is ever considered but only the speaker. It is so much easier to pass judgment on a man than on an idea." Mr. President, I, like every member in this body, am a flawed human being, a man of many imperfections. If a reporter wants to write on those imperfections, there's no shortage of material. But as long as they're writing on those, they're not talking about the ideas. As long as they're writing about the personalities, they're not talking about the American people that are suffering. As long as they're writing about the personalities, about the politics and the back and forth and the game playing and the insults and all of the nonsense, they are not talking about the millions of Americans who are desperate for greater opportunity, desperate for a job, desperate to work to provide for their family. Letter after letter after letter of real people, real live people who are losing their health insurance. Another quote: "Fight for the value of your person. Fight for the virtue of your pride. Fight for the essence of that which is man, for his sovereign rational mind. Fight with the radiant certainty and absolute rectitude of knowing that yours is the morality of life and that yours is the battle for any achievement, any value, any grandeur, any goodness, any joy that has ever existed on this earth." Another from the Fountainhead: "Throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads, armed with nothing but their own vision. Their goals differed, but they all had this in common, that the step was first the road new, the vision unborrowed, and the response they received, hatred. The great creators, the thinkers, the artists, the scientists, the inventors stood alone against the men of their time. Every great new thought was opposed. Every great new invention was denounced. The first motor was considered foolish. The airplane was considered impossible. The power loom was considered vicious. Anesthesia was considered sinful. But the men of unborrowed vision went ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid, but they won." Mr. President, let me suggest that quote speaks directly to the millions of Americans who are speaking up right now, who are saying, Washington says we can't stop Obamacare. Washington says we have to accept this train wreck, this nightmare. There's nothing we can do. And yet the message, Ms. Rand says, is that if the American people stand up together, if they believe in their vision, together we can make D.C. listen. And indeed, also from Atlas Shrugged, in terms of the divide we see in this body, Ms. Rand observed, "There are two sides to every issue. One side is right and the other is wrong. But the middle is always evil. The man who is wrong still retains some respect for the truth, if only by accepting the responsibility of choice. But the man in the middle is the knave who blanks out the truth in order to pretend that no choice or values exist, who is willing to sit out the course of any battle, willing to cash in on the blood of the innocent or just crawl on his belly to the guilty, who dispenses justice by condemning both the robber and the robbed to jail, who solves conflicts by ordering the thinker and the fool to meet each other halfway." Now, Mr. President, I would suggest that comment speaks volumes to this dispute. As we observed during the middle of this debate, there are some members of the Democratic Conference, indeed one we discussed with Senator Sanders from Vermont, who openly embraces his ideals. Indeed, there was a time when he ran for public office, not as a Democrat, but as a socialist. Now, Mr. Sanders and I agree on very little when it comes to public policy, but I will say this: I respect his fidelity to his principles. I respect the honesty with which he embraces them. And as I observed earlier in this proceedings, I would far rather a Senate with 10 Bernie Sanders and 10 Mike Lees to a Senate where the views, the actual commitments are blurred by obfuscation. When it comes to the Republican side of the aisle, there are some senators who have been quite open in saying they don't think we can defund Obamacare. And I would respect any Republican senator who says, "I'm convinced we can't do this, and therefore I'm voting for cloture because we can't do it, and so I'm voting against it." I don't agree with that. I think that is a defeatist philosophy, but it's an honest philosophy. I would suggest, Mr. President, it is far different for a Republican to say, "I'm going to vote for cloture. I'm going to vote to give Harry Reid and 51 Democrats the ability to fund Obamacare in its entirety with no amendments, no changes whatsoever. But at the same time, I'm going to go to my constituents and say, I enthusiastically support defunding Obamacare. Indeed, I'm leading the fight." Mr. President, that is not being honest with the American people. If we are to listen to the people, part of listening to the people is being honest with the people. Part of listening to the people is embracing quite candidly the position we hold. If those members of this conference want to disagree with this strategy and say, "We agree with Harry Reid that Obamacare should not be defunded on the continuing resolution," then let them say so openly, not cloaked in robes of procedural deception and obscurity. Let them say so openly to the American people and let them make their case. That has the virtue of truth. On Obamacare, in Atlas Shrugged, Ms. Rand wrote, "There's no way to rule innocent men. The only power any government has is the power to crack down on criminals. Well, there aren't enough criminals. Well, when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for me to live without breaking laws. But just pass the kind of laws that can be neither be observed nor enforced, nor objectively interpreted. And then you create a nation of lawbreakers. And then you cash in on the guilt." Now, that's the system, Mr. Reardon. That's the game. And once you understand it, you'll be much easier to deal with. You know, Mr. President, that is really a profound insight on the train wreck, on the nightmare that is Obamacare. You know, one statement that the senator from Kentucky made that I would disagree with slightly. The senator from Kentucky said President Obama is committed 100% to Obamacare, to making no changes, no alterations, to defending it as is, not to improving it. And I actually don't think that's accurate. I think what the president has done is far worse than that, actually, which is the president has opposed legislative changes to fix the tremendous failures in Obamacare that are hurting the American people. But the President has over and over again unilaterally, abusing executive power, just disregarded the law. When the President decided unilaterally that the employer mandate that was set to kick in on January 1 of next year would be delayed for a year for big business. There's no basis in law for him to do so. The statute says otherwise. But his decision was simply, l'état c'est moi. I am the state, therefore this is delayed. Likewise, when the President made the decision that the eligibility verification for subsidies written into the statute would not be enforced. That's contrary to law. The President doesn't have the authority to disregard the statute. If he doesn't like it, he can come to Congress and ask for an amendment. But the statutes written in the law books are binding law. And he simply announced, no, they're not. I'm not going to enforce it. Now that, of all the different unilateral changes, that may be the most consequential. It's one of the least discussed, but it's consequential because its effect is essentially to encourage liar loans. To say anyone, whether you're eligible for subsidies or not, just say you are, and we're not going to check to find out. And perhaps most egregiously was the President's action exempting members of Congress. Now, the statute provides that members of Congress shall be subject to Obamacare, shall be put on the exchanges without employer subsidies, just like millions of Americans. And, Mr. President, as you and I both know well, that had members of Congress, that had congressional staff in a panic. And so Majority Leader Harry Reid, Democratic senators, met with the President, and according to the public press accounts, asked for an exemption, said, please exempt us. And although the statute is clear, and it was written that way, I would note, because of my friend, Senator Chuck Grassley, who added that amendment on the principle that if we're going to put a burden on the American people, we should feel it, we should have skin in the game. And according to the press reports, the President said he would take care of the problem, and shortly thereafter his administration did so and just said, we're going to disregard the law of the land. We're going to disregard the statutes. Now let me say, Mr. President, when the President of the United States begins picking and choosing which laws to follow and which laws not, when the President of the United States looks at this mess that is Obamacare and begins pulling out the eraser and saying, I'm going to erase this part of the statute, I'm going to erase this part of the statute, I'm going to pick that it applies to these people, but I'm going to pick that it doesn't apply to these people. That is the height of arbitrary enforcement. It is also contrary to his constitutional obligation. Article 2 of the Constitution obliges the President to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. To deliberately, willfully, and openly refuse to enforce the law is the antithesis of taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. Indeed, it is taking care to refuse to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And that's the pattern we've seen. And, Mr. President, for any president to do so, Democrat or Republican, and I can tell you this, Mr. President, if there were a Republican president in office and he were saying, I'm going to disregard the laws of the United States, I can promise you I would be right here on the floor of the Senate decrying that Republican president just as loudly as decrying President Obama for disregarding the law. Now, look, I think Obamacare is a disaster. I think it's a train wreck. I agree with James Hoffa, President of the Teamsters, it's a nightmare, but I don't think the President can just say, I'm going to refuse to apply it to everyone. You haven't heard me call on President Obama just granting a lawless exemption to everyone. He didn't have authority to grant an exemption to big business. He didn't have authority to grant an exemption to members of Congress. And he doesn't have authority to grant exemption to the American people. Only Congress does. And, Mr. President, that's why Congress needs to act. That's why this body, why Democrats in this body, why Republicans in this body need to listen to the American people. Mr. President, together we must make D.C. listen.